Imagine a jar, a simple clay jar sealed with wax buried beneath the floorboards of a house in southern China. The house belongs to a widow. She lives alone. The neighbors whisper about her, but no one dares to speak too loudly. Inside that jar, something is alive. Not one thing, 100 things. Scorpions with their tails curled, ready to strike. Centipedes as long as a man's hand, their legs rippling like waves. Venomous snakes coiled around each other, tongues flicking in the darkness. Spiders, toads, wasps, all trapped together in absolute blackness in a space no larger than a human's skull. They have no food, no water, no light, only each other. So they do what any creature does when survival is the only option. They kill. The scorpion strikes first, driving its stinger into the soft belly of a toad, but the toad's skin secretes poison of its own, and the scorpion begins to convulse. A centipede seizes the moment, wrapping itself around the dying scorpion, mandibles tearing into flesh. A snake watches, waits, then strikes, Jan swallowing the centipede whole while it is still feeding. Day after day, week after week, the strong devour the weak. Venom meets venom. Poison absorbs poison. The survivors grow larger, stranger, more terrible. Their bodies become repositories of accumulated toxins, living vessels of concentrated death, until finally, after weeks or months, only one remains. It no longer resembles the creature it once was. Bloated, misshapen, pulsing with the stolen life force of all its victims, it sits in the darkness at the bottom of the jar, waiting. The ancient Chinese had a name for this survivor. They called it gu, and for over 2,000 years it was considered the most terrifying weapon in China. Not because it was a myth, not because it was a legend told to frighten children, but because the government believed it was real. To understand Gu, you need to travel to the mountains of southwestern China, Yunnan, Guizhou, Guangxi, Hunan. These are names that most Westerners have never heard, places that rarely appear in history books or travel guides. But for thousands of years, these misty highlands were home to some of the most complex and sophisticated cultures in Asia. The Miao, the Yao, the Dong, the Zhuang. Dozens of ethnic groups, each with their own language, their own customs, their own relationship with the natural world. They built villages on mountainsides so steep that their houses seemed to hang from the clouds. They cultivated rice in terraces carved into the earth over generations. They knew the names and properties of thousands of plants, insects, and animals. And they knew things about poison that the Han Chinese Empire could never understand. To the imperial court in the north, these were the southern barbarians, Jan people who lived beyond the reach of civilization, who worshipped strange gods in dark forests, who spoke languages that sounded like the chattering of birds. The Han Chinese had conquered their lands, technically, but they had never truly controlled them. The mountains were too high, the valleys too deep, the people too stubborn, and the darkest rumor of all was that these people practiced Gu. The earliest written records of Gu date back over Lianzhen Wu by years to the spring and autumn period. When China was still a patchwork of warring states, the character itself tells the story. Look at it closely. Gu. The top half shows 3 insects, Jantron, repeated 3 times. The bottom half shows a vessel Janmin, a container with a wide mouth, 3 insects. One vessel, the meaning is clear even before you read the definition. The ancient dictionary Shuowen Jizi, compiled by the scholar Xu Xin, defines Gu with clinical precision. Insects in the belly. But that sterile definition hides a far more disturbing reality. According to texts spanning from the Han dynasty to the Qing, the creation of Gu followed a specific ritual passed down through generations in whispered instructions. First, you gather venomous creatures. The recipes vary depending on the source. Some call for 5 Jan, the 5 poisons of traditional Chinese symbolism: snake, scorpion, centipede, toad, and spider. Others call for 12, corresponding to the animals of the zodiac. The most extreme recipes demand 100 creatures, each one more deadly than the last. The gathering must happen at specific times. Some texts specify the 5th day of the 5th lunar month, Jan, the Dragon Boat Festival, when yang energy is at its peak and poisonous creatures are most active. Others require the hour of the rat between 11 at night and 1 in the morning. When the boundary between the living and dead worlds grows thin, then you seal them in a container. A clay jar is most common, but bronze vessels appear in older accounts and bamboo tubes in more recent ones. The container must be airtight, no light can enter, no sound can escape. And then you wait. Some texts say 40 Jan 9 days, Jan 7 times 7, a number of profound mystical significance. Others say 100 days or a full year. The container must be buried in a specific location under the bed where you sleep. Beneath the threshold of your door, at a crossroads where three paths meet. In a graveyard at midnight, in the darkness, the creatures turn on each other. The process is not quick. It is not cleaned. It is a slow apocalypse in miniature, a war of all against all fought in absolute blackness. The creatures do not simply kill Jan, they consume. Each death adds to the survivor's power. Each meal transfers venom from the eaten to the eater. When you finally dig up the jar and break the seal, what you find inside is no longer recognizable as any natural creature. It has become something else, something new, something that exists nowhere in nature, because nature would never create such a thing. This is the Giyu, and according to believers, it could be weaponized in ways that would make any modern poisoner envious. Grind it into powder, mix it with food or drink. The victim would consume it without knowing, without tasting anything unusual. And then, slowly, over days or weeks or months, they would begin to die. The symptoms were distinctive. First, a vague unease, a sense that something was wrong, then stomach pains. Mild at first, growing sharper, loss of appetite, difficulty sleeping. Strange dreams. The victim would waste away, growing thinner and weaker, while doctors found nothing wrong, no fever, no infection, no explanation. And then, finally, death, no wound, no trace, no evidence. The perfect murder. But here is what makes goo different from ordinary poison. What elevates it from chemistry to something far more terrifying. It wasn't just a substance, it was a relationship. The texts are clear on this point, even if modern readers find it difficult to accept. Goo was not merely a poison, it was a living thing with needs and desires of its own. And once you created it, you were bound to it forever. The relationship between a Giyu and its keeper was described in terms that sound almost like a marriage, Jan, or perhaps more accurately, like slavery. The Giyu required feeding, regular offerings of blood, of food, of attention. In return, it would serve its master, carrying out tasks that ranged from the mundane to the murderous. Some Goo were said to bring wealth. They would slip into neighbors' houses at night, invisible and silent, and steal grain, money, valuables. The keeper would grow rich while those around them grew poor, and no one could explain why. Other Giyu were instruments of revenge, point them at an enemy, speak the proper incantations, and they would find their target no matter how far away. They would enter through the mouth, the nose, the ears, the pores of the skin. They would nest in the victim's organs and begin their slow work of destruction. But the most disturbing accounts describe Giyu that demanded something more than blood or food. They demanded death. According to some traditions, a Giyu that was not regularly fed with human victims would turn on its keeper. The poison that had been directed outward would flow inward instead. The master would become the victim, dying the same slow death they had inflicted on others. This created a terrible logic. Once you possessed a Giyu, you could never stop using it. You were trapped in an endless cycle of murder, killing not out of hatred or greed, but simply to survive. Each victim bought you a few more months of life. Each death postponed your own. The Giyu was not a tool, it was a parasite. And the keeper was as much a victim as anyone they poisoned. This belief had profound social consequences in communities where Giyu was feared. Certain families became marked. They were Gu families, Jan households, where the curse had taken root generations ago and could never be removed. These families were shunned, avoided, treated as untouchable. No one would marry their children, no one would share a meal with them, no one would even walk too close to their houses. The accusation of keeping Gu was, in effect, a social death sentence, and once applied, it could never be removed. The stain passed from parent to child, generation after generation, long after anyone remembered the original accusation. But the imperial government was not content to let communities police themselves. Gu was too dangerous to be left to village gossip. It required the full weight of the law. The Sui dynasty has just unified China after nearly 4 centuries of chaos and division. Emperor Wen, the founder, is consolidating his power, standardizing laws, rebuilding infrastructure, trying to create a single nation out of dozens of warring fragments. Among his many decrees is one that might seem strange to modern eyes. Those who create or keep goo shall be executed by strangulation. This was not a minor provision buried in some obscure legal code. It was a capital offense ranked alongside murder, treason, and rebellion. The emperor of a newly unified China, facing threats on every border and challenges from every direction, took time out of his busy schedule to address the problem of insects in jars. Why? The answer becomes clear when you look at what happened next. Every major dynasty that followed Jian, Tang, Song, Yuan, Ming, Qing, Jian included anti-Jian Jiyu laws in their legal codes. The Tang Code have devoted an entire section to curses and sorcery. Jian, with Jiyu prominently featured, the penalties were severe and specific. Creating Jiyu, death by strangulation. Possessing Jiyu, death by strangulation. Teaching others to create Jiyu, death by strangulation. Failing to report someone who possessed Jiyu, exile to a distant frontier. Being related to someone who possessed Jiyu, exile for the entire family. The law did not distinguish between successful and unsuccessful poisoning. The mere act of creating Jiyu was enough to warrant execution, even if it was never used. Intent was irrelevant. Results were irrelevant. The crime was the creation itself, but the most revealing aspect of these laws was not the punishment. It was the procedure. The Tang Code specified exactly how Jiyu cases should be investigated. Officials were instructed to search the suspect's home for jars, vessels, or containers that might hold Jiyu. They were told to look for unusual deaths among the suspect's neighbors, Jian patterns of illness that could not be explained by natural causes. They were authorized to use torture to extract confessions, and they were warned to be thorough, because Jiyu, unlike other crimes, left no evidence. There was no body to examine, no weapon to recover, no witness to interrogate. The poison worked invisibly, over time, mimicking natural illness. A skilled Jiyu user could kill dozens of people without ever being suspected. This made Jiyu the perfect crime, and it made the fear of Jiyu the perfect tool of political control. The Han Dynasty is at the height of its power, ruling over an empire that stretches from the Korean peninsula to the deserts of Central Asia. Emperor Wu, who has reigned for over 50 years, is one of the most celebrated rulers in Chinese history. Jian, a conqueror, a reformer, a patron of arts and letters. He is also, by this point, deeply paranoid. Emperor Wu is old. He has outlived most of his sons, most of his ministers, most of his enemies. He has spent decades surrounded by plots and conspiracies, real and imagined. He trusts no one. He sees threats everywhere. And then someone whispers in his ear about goo. The details of what happened next are still debated by historians. What is certain is that Emperor Wu became convinced that someone in the palace was using sorcery against him. Wooden dolls were found buried in the ground, Jian effigies used in curse rituals. Accusations flew, arrests followed. The investigation spiraled out of control with terrifying speed. First, the emperor's favorite concubine was implicated, then several ministers. Then the crown prince himself, Jian, the heir to the throne, the man who was supposed to continue the dynasty. The crown prince, desperate and cornered, did something unprecedented. He raised an army within the capital, attempting to arrest the officials who were persecuting him. Street fighting broke out in the heart of the empire. Thousands died in the chaos. The rebellion failed. The crown prince fled the city, was cornered by imperial troops, and took his own life rather than face capture. His mother, the empress, was stripped of her title and left to die in disgrace. His children were hunted down and killed, but the purge didn't stop there. Anyone connected to the crown prince was suspect. Anyone who had ever spoken to him, served him, or been seen near him was arrested and interrogated. The torture chambers filled. The execution grounds ran red. By the time Emperor Wu finally called a halt to the madness, Jian, by some accounts, only after realizing that his own son had been innocent, Jian, an estimated 40,000 people had died. 40,000, for comparison, that is roughly the population of a medium Jian-sized city in ancient China. An entire city's worth of people executed or driven to suicide because of rumors about insects in jars. Historians call it the witchcraft disaster. It was one of the bloodiest political purges in Chinese history, exceeded only by the mass killings of the 20th century, and it set a pattern that would repeat again and again. Tang Emperor Gaozong's first empress, Empress Wang, was deposed and eventually killed. The official charge, practicing Gyu against the emperor's favorite concubine, the future empress, Wu Zetian. Whether the accusation was true or fabricated has been debated for over 1,000 years. What is certain is that it worked. The Ming dynasty was paralyzed by the case of the wooden clubs and a bizarre incident in which a man armed with a wooden stick somehow penetrated the heavily guarded palace and attacked the crown prince. The investigation quickly turned to sorcery. Dozens were arrested. The case was never solved, but careers were destroyed and lives were ruined. The Qing Emperor Yongzheng launched a massive campaign against Jiyu in the southwestern provinces. Thousands of people were arrested. Hundreds were executed. Entire villages were destroyed. Their inhabitants killed or scattered. Their homes burned to the ground. The pattern was always the same. A rumor, an accusation, a spiral of fear and violence that consumed the innocent along with the guilty, Jan if there were any guilty at all. Gu had become something more than a poison. It had become a weapon of mass destruction. Not because it killed people directly, but because the fear of it could be used to kill anyone. Let's pause here and ask a question that has probably been forming in your mind since the beginning. Was any of this real? Could you actually create a super Jan poison by sealing venomous creatures in a jar and letting them kill each other? The answer, surprisingly, is maybe. Modern toxicology has identified hundreds of bioactive compounds in the venom of snakes, scorpions, spiders, centipedes, and other creatures. These are not simple substances. They are complex cocktails of proteins, peptides, and enzymes, each designed by millions of years of evolution to incapacitate or kill. Neurotoxins that block nerve signals causing paralysis and suffocation. Hemotoxins that destroy red blood cells causing internal bleeding and organ failure. Cytotoxins that dissolve cell membranes, liquefying tissue from the inside out. Cardiotoxins that stop the heart. Myotoxins that destroy muscle. When venomous creatures fight and consume each other, these toxins don't simply disappear. They concentrate. A single scorpion contains perhaps a few milligrams of venom, enough to cause pain and swelling in a human, but rarely enough to kill. But a scorpion that has consumed 10 other scorpions, 2050. The accumulated toxins could reach levels far beyond what any single creature could produce. Moreover, the process of digestion doesn't necessarily destroy these compounds. Many venoms are designed to survive the harsh environment of the digestive system, and that is how they work when injected into prey. A creature that eats another venomous creature may absorb and store those toxins in its own tissues. The result would be something genuinely dangerous. Not a supernatural entity, but a biological weapon, a living reservoir of concentrated poison. The symptoms described in ancient texts are consistent with this interpretation. Chronic poisoning by a cocktail of biological toxins would produce exactly the effects that Jiyu was said to cause: gradual onset, vague initial symptoms, progressive deterioration, eventual death. The poison would be difficult to detect because it wasn't a single substance but a mixture of dozens of compounds, each present in small amounts. A skilled forensic toxicologist today might be able to identify such a poisoning. An ancient Chinese doctor, working without microscopes or chemical analysis, would have no chance. But there is another factor that science can explain, one that may be even more important than the chemistry: the nocebo effect. You've probably heard of the placebo effect, the phenomenon where patients improve simply because they believe they're receiving treatment. The nocebo effect is its dark mirror. Patients who believe they've been harmed can develop real symptoms even when nothing has actually been done to them. The nocebo effect is not imagination. It is not all in your head in the dismissive sense. It is a measurable physiological response. Belief triggers stress hormones. Stress hormones affect the immune system, the digestive system, the cardiovascular system. Chronic stress can cause weight loss, insomnia, depression, and increased susceptibility to disease. In a society where everyone believed in Jiyu, where the mere accusation could mean social death or actual execution, the psychological terror alone could produce devastating effects. Imagine being told that someone has poisoned you with Jiyu. You don't know if it is true. You can't prove it is false. Every stomach ache becomes a symptom. Every sleepless night becomes evidence. You watch yourself for signs of deterioration, and because you're watching, you find them. Your appetite disappears. Your sleep becomes fragmented. Your immune system weakens. You catch every cold, every infection. You lose weight. You grow pale, you look, to everyone around you, exactly like someone who has been poisoned. And maybe you have been, or maybe you've poisoned yourself with fear. The genius of Jiyu Jan, if we can call it that, Jan, was that it didn't matter whether the poison was real. The belief was enough in the historical records. One pattern emerges with disturbing consistency. The practitioners of Jiyu were almost always described as women. Gu women, Gu wives, Gu witches. The language itself reveals the prejudice. Men might be accused of many crimes, Jan rebellion, corruption, murder Jan, but Gu was feminine. It was the weapon of the weak, the marginalized, the powerless. It was how women fought back against a world that gave them no other options. Or so the accusers claimed. In the Han Chinese imagination, the women of the southern minorities were especially dangerous. They were beautiful. And the texts never fail to mention this. Jan, with their elaborate silver jewelry, their colorful embroidered clothes, their songs and dances that seemed to cast a spell on anyone who watched. They were mysterious, speaking languages that sounded like incantations, practicing rituals that no outsider could understand. And they knew things about plants, about animals, about the hidden properties of the natural world. In the villages of the Southwest, women were often the keepers of medical knowledge. They knew which herbs could reduce fever, which roots could ease the pain of childbirth, which mushrooms could cure and which could kill. This knowledge was passed from mother to daughter, grandmother to granddaughter, in an unbroken chain stretching back generations to the imperial bureaucrats sent to govern these regions. Such knowledge was suspicious. It was uncontrolled. It existed outside the official medical texts, outside the examination system, outside the structures of male authority. It was, in a word, power. And power in the hands of women was terrifying. The stereotype of the Gu woman served multiple purposes. It explained why Han Chinese men who ventured into the southern mountains sometimes fell ill or died, and not because of malaria, or dysentery, or the simple dangers of travel, but because seductive native women had poisoned them. It justified the conquest and civilization of minority peoples. They needed to be saved from their own dark practices. It reinforced the subordination of women everywhere. See what happens when females are allowed to accumulate knowledge and power. The consequences of this stereotype were measured in blood. When the Qing dynasty launched its campaigns to bring the Southwest under direct imperial control in the 18th century, anti-Jan Jiyu purges were a key instrument of conquest. The policy was called replacing native chieftains with appointed officials Jan, but it was implemented with fire and sword. Local women were rounded up on the slightest suspicion, a neighbor's grudge, a spurned suitor's revenge, an unexplained illness in the village. Any of these could trigger an accusation, and once accused, there was little hope of escape. The interrogations were brutal. Torture was standard practice in the Qing legal system, and Gu cases were no exception. Women were beaten, burned, suspended by their limbs, subjected to techniques designed to break the body and the will, and they confessed. Of course they confessed. Everyone confesses eventually when the pain becomes unbearable. They confessed to making Jiyu, to using Jiyu, to teaching others to make Jiyu. They named names, Jan other women, neighbors, relatives, Jan, and those women were arrested in turn. The confessions were used to justify further persecution. See, the threat is real. The witches have admitted their crimes. We must be even more vigilant. A self-Jan-fulfilling prophecy of fear and violence, consuming the innocent and the guilty alike, Jan if there were any guilty at all. Historians estimate that thousands of women were executed for Jiyu Jan-related accusations during the Qing dynasty alone. The exact number is impossible to determine. Many cases were handled locally. Without records reaching the capital, many victims died under torture before they could be formally executed. Many simply disappeared. Their real crime was not sorcery. It was being different. Being female, being in possession of knowledge that men could not control, being in the wrong place at the wrong time. You might think that Jiyu is a relic of the past, a superstition that died with the last emperor, swept away by revolution and modernization and scientific education. You would be wrong. In the rural areas of Yunnan, Guizhou, and Guangxi, belief in Gu persists to this day. Not universally, Jan, the cities have largely moved on, Jan, but in the villages, in the mountains, in the places where the old ways have never entirely disappeared. Anthropologists conducting fieldwork in the early Liaotian found that many villagers still feared GU, still accused neighbors of practicing it, still ostracized families with the GU reputation. A study published in Liaotian documented ongoing GU-Jan-related social discrimination in a Miao village in Guizhou province. The researchers found that certain families had been labeled as GU households for generations. No one remembered the original accusation, no one could point to any specific crime, but the stigma remained, passed down like a curse from parent to child. These families could not marry outside their group, Jan no one would accept their sons or daughters. Their businesses were boycotted, Jan no one would buy from them or sell to them. Their children were bullied in school, excluded from games, called names that their classmates had learned from their parents. The poison jar may be empty, but the fear it created still lingers. Meanwhile, GU has found new life in Chinese popular culture. Horror movies feature beautiful GU witches who seduce and destroy. Fantasy novels describe elaborate GU techniques with the detail of technical manuals. Video games let players collect and deploy GU creatures against their enemies. The image of the seductive Gu woman Zan, beautiful, dangerous, exotic Zan, has become a staple of the entertainment industry. She appears in period dramas set in ancient China, in modern thrillers about rural superstition, in fantasy epics where magic is real and deadly, exotic, dangerous, sexy. The same stereotypes that got real women killed are now being recycled for clicks and box office revenue. The same fears that fueled witch hunts are now fuel for entertainment. Is this progress? Is this healing? Or is it just a new form of the same old exploitation? The descendants of the communities that suffered most from Gu persecution are still debating these questions. Some argue that the popular culture representations are harmful, perpetuating stereotypes and trivializing real suffering. Others see an opportunity to reclaim the narrative, to tell their own stories on their own terms. What they agree on is that the history matters. The thousands who died, the families who were destroyed, the knowledge that was lost when the women who carried it were silenced forever. That history deserves to be remembered. Let's return, one last time, to that jar, the simple clay jar sealed with wax buried beneath the floorboards. The jar that contained 100 creatures fighting and dying in the darkness. The jar that produced something terrible, something unnatural, something that could kill without leaving a trace. Except now we know the truth. The jar was never the point. The insects were never the point. GU was always about something else. It was about fear. The fear of the unknown, the unexplained, the uncontrolled. The fear of people who were different, Zan, who spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, possessed different knowledge. The fear of women who knew things that men did not, who held power that men could not take away. It was about suspicion. The willingness to believe the worst about our neighbors, our rivals, our enemies, the readiness to accept accusations without evidence, to condemn without proof, to destroy lives on the basis of rumor and prejudice. It was about power, the power of the state to define what was criminal and what was permitted, the power of the majority to persecute the minority, the power of accusation itself, Jan, the ability to ruin someone simply by pointing a finger and speaking a word. You don't need venomous insects to create Gi. You just need a closed container, Jan, a community, a nation, a world, Jan, where people are trapped together in darkness. You just need scarcity, or fear, or the belief that resources are limited, and someone else is taking more than their share. You just need someone willing to make an accusation, and others willing to believe it. The creatures will do the rest. They will turn on each other, as creatures do when survival is at stake. They will kill and consume, growing stronger on the deaths of their neighbors. And in the end, something monstrous will emerge, Jan, something that no one intended, something that no one can control. The real poison was never in the jar. It was always in us, in our fear of difference, in our suspicion of the other, in our willingness to believe that someone somewhere is working dark magic against us, Jan, and that the only solution is to strike first. Strike hard. Strike without mercy. The jar is empty now. The insects are gone. The rituals are forgotten. But the fear remains. And as long as it does, Gu will never truly die.